Warren Aldrich had spent 31 years building things that other men said couldn't be built in places they said weren't worth building in. He had started with a single dry cleaning storefront in South Phoenix when he was 24, borrowed against a truck he barely owned, and by the time he turned 55, he had turned that one store into a regional logistics company worth $380 million. He knew what it felt like to eat rice 4 nights in a row because the alternative was not making payroll. He had not forgotten. The problem was that the two people who stood to inherit everything he had built had never once been asked to remember anything at all. His daughter Simone was 32. She held the title of Director of Strategic Partnerships at Aldrich Distribution, a title Warren had created for her 2 years ago, because she was sharp enough to deserve a real role, and because he had not yet figured out how to give her one that required her to be uncomfortable. Simone was good at meetings. She prepared thoroughly, dressed well, asked the right questions. But when the meeting ended, she handed everything to someone else and moved on. And the someone else was always a junior employee who understood that certain names in the company did not get pushed back on. She lived in a Scottsdale apartment Warren paid for. She drove a car Warren leased. She had a personal trainer Warren had initially offered as a birthday gift 3 years ago and which had since become a line item in the household budget the way electricity was a line item, unremarkable, continuous, expected. Her husband Kieran was 35. He had married Simone 4 years earlier in a ceremony at a resort outside Sedona that cost more than Warren's first 3 years of rent combined. Kieran had a business degree from Arizona State and a confident manner that read, at a distance, as competence. Up close it was harder to say what it was. He had worked briefly in commercial real estate, then in financial consulting, then in a company he described as a venture fund but which had no announced investments and no discernible activity beyond a well-designed website and a LinkedIn presence. Kieran updated more often than most people updated their grocery lists. The monthly transfers Warren sent, which Kieran called bridge funding between rounds, had been arriving for 3 years. Warren had never asked what they were bridging toward. He was beginning to think that was the wrong question. The right question was whether Kieran had any intention of reaching the other side. It was a Tuesday evening in October when Warren made up his mind. Not with drama, not with anger. The way you make up your mind about something you've been circling for a long time when you finally admit you've been circling. He called Simone and Kieran into the study of the Tempe house, the room with the old roll-top desk that had belonged to his father and the photograph of his mother standing outside the dry cleaning storefront on its first day of operation. The door not yet fully painted, the sign slightly crooked, her face entirely certain. 2 envelopes on the desk when they walked in. Warren did not offer them coffee. He did not begin with explanation. He said, "There's $200 in each envelope. That's all you have for 30 days starting Friday at midnight. I'm pausing the transfers. I'm pausing the lease payments. Your corporate cards are being suspended. Your phone emergencies only. You keep your personal devices, but the company accounts are frozen. You leave here Friday night with what you're carrying and whatever is in your personal accounts, which I believe in both cases is not much. 30 days. Come back on the 1st of November and tell me what you built." Simone looked at her father the way people look at someone who has just said something in a language they did not know he spoke. Kieran picked up his envelope and turned it in his hands, the gesture of a man who was accustomed to finding the angle. "This is a test," he said. It was not quite a question. It was more like a man confirming a category so he could begin strategizing inside it. "It's a fact," Warren said. The test was the last 3 years. This is the result. Neither of them said anything after that. Simone looked at her father's face for a long moment, the way she used to look at his face when she was small and trying to determine whether something was serious or a game. She had always been good at reading him. What she saw now was that this was neither. It was something quieter and more final than either. She took the envelope. She did not slam it. She set it carefully in her bag and walked out of the study without looking at Kieran, which told Warren more than anything either of them had said. Friday came the way. October Fridays come in Phoenix, the heat finally pulling back just enough that the evenings were almost forgiving. At midnight, Warren sat in the study with the lamp on and listened to the house settle into the particular silence of a place that has fewer people in it than it expected. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon. He did not drink it immediately. He sat with it and thought about his mother standing outside that first storefront with the crooked sign and the unpainted door and the absolute certainty on her face. She had died before the company reached its second location. She had never seen what it became. He thought sometimes that this was a specific kind of loss, the person who believed in the thing before there was evidence to believe in. He had been trying to give his daughter evidence for 2 years. He was no longer sure evidence was what she needed. Simone had $1,340 in her personal checking account when she left the house Friday night. She had not told Kieran the amount, and Kieran had not told her his, which was $180 and a PayPal balance of $23 he had forgotten about. They drove in the same car to the apartment in Scottsdale, which was still technically in Simone's name, though the rent had been pulled from her father's account so automatically that she had not thought about the number in more than a year. They sat in the parking lot for a moment and then went inside without speaking much. Saturday morning, Kieran was already working. This was, Simone thought, the right word for what he was doing. He was on the phone. He had his laptop open. He was making notes on a legal pad with the particular energy of a man who has decided that the situation is actually an opportunity and is excited to begin demonstrating this to others. By 11, he had 3 meetings scheduled. A contact at a commercial real estate firm in Scottsdale, who he described as a potential co-investment partner. A former colleague who was, Kieran explained, well connected to family offices. A lunch with someone he referred to as a high-net-worth individual interested in emerging technology. Simone watched him prepare for the lunch, watched him select the right shirt, watched him rehearse his pitch in fragments while walking between rooms, and felt something she did not immediately have a word for. It was not quite admiration. It was not quite dread. It was something in between. Something that knew without having the language yet that none of these meetings were going to produce what Kieran believed they were going to produce. She was right. He came home from the lunch at 3:30 with the energy of a man who had performed very well in a room and had not yet realized the performance had produced no result. The high-net-worth individual had been interested. Very interested. Things were in motion. There were follow-ups to be had. There were $32 fewer dollars in the envelope. Simone spent Saturday differently. She sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad of her own and did not write anything for 40 minutes. She wrote the number 340 at the top of the page. She wrote 30 below it. She wrote the word rent and then crossed it out because rent was not available to her as a concept the way it was. A concept for other people. It existed as a number she had never looked up, a thing that happened in the background like weather. She looked it up now. The apartment was $2,400 a month. The lease was in her name. The next payment was in 19 days. She sat with that number for a long time. Then she wrote 2 columns, skills and contacts. Under skills, she wrote negotiation, presentation, client relationship management. She looked at those words for a while. Then she added, below them and slightly off to the side, as though she was not sure they counted, organized, reliable, fast learner. Under contacts, she wrote 12 names and then put a star next to the ones who knew her as a person rather than as Warren Aldrich's daughter. There were 2 stars. She called the first one a woman named Beverly she had met at a non-profit board she'd served on briefly 2 years ago. Beverly answered on the second ring and talked to her like a person and said yes, without hesitation, when Simone asked if she knew anyone who needed administrative or coordination help on a short-term basis. Beverly said she'd make some calls. Simone hung up and sat for a moment with the unexpected weight of having asked for something genuinely without knowing whether the answer would be yes. By Monday, Simone had 3 interviews arranged. By Thursday, she had a position, 22 hours a week coordinating volunteers and scheduling for a community health organization in Mesa, $16 an hour, starting the following Monday. The work was not what she was used to. The office had fluorescent lighting and a coffee maker that required a specific sequence of button presses and a break room that smelled faintly of someone's lunch from the day before. She took notes on everything. She asked questions she was not afraid to admit she needed to ask. The woman who ran the office, a retired nurse named Eugenia, who did not know Warren Aldrich and had no reason to treat Simone like anyone but the person sitting in front of her, told her on her second day that she was the most prepared volunteer coordinator they'd had in years. "Volunteer coordinator is not what I usually do," Simone said. "I know," Eugenia said. That's why it's worth saying. Meanwhile, Kieran had spent the better part of the first 2 weeks in motion. He had meetings in the morning and calls in the afternoon and follow-ups in the evening. He had built a deck. He had refined the deck. He had sent the deck to 11 people and received 7 responses that were variations of the word interesting paired with a request for more information that never quite resolved into a meeting. He had spent $68 on business lunches, $45 on a co-working day pass that gave him access to a professional-looking space for a pitch he had scheduled, and that was rescheduled twice, and then quietly never rescheduled again. By the end of week 2, he had $55 left and no revenue, and a posture that was beginning to cost him energy he did not have to spare. On a Wednesday afternoon, he walked into his Subway near the co-working space and ordered something and sat down and looked at his phone, and did not look at his phone and looked at it again. The woman at the table next to him was reading a physical newspaper, which was not something he had seen anyone do in several years. She was in her late 60s, he guessed, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a canvas bag on the floor next to her that said Public Library, Maricopa County on the side. She noticed him looking at his phone, the way you notice someone who is looking at their phone, the way they are trying to disappear inside it. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she folded her newspaper to the section she wanted and said, without looking up, "Whatever you're waiting for isn't in there." Kieran looked up. She said, "I spent 20 years waiting for the right opportunity to come through a screen. Then I stopped and built the thing I already knew how to build." She turned a page. "What do you already know how to build?" She did not wait for an answer. She finished her section, folded the newspaper, put it in her canvas bag, and left. Kieran sat for a long time after she walked out. The question was simple enough to be embarrassing. He had a business degree. He had 11 contacts who described themselves as interested. He had a deck with slides that looked good in low lighting. The question was what he actually knew how to build, not in the language of pitch decks and co-investment structures, but with his actual hands and actual time. The answer, when it came, was smaller than he expected, and more honest. He had worked briefly during college at his uncle's property management company doing maintenance coordination. He had been good at it. Not the administrative part, the actual logistical problem-solving part, the part where someone's water heater failed on a Saturday and you had to find a licensed plumber who would answer their phone. He had been good at staying calm when things broke. He had not thought about this in years because it did not appear anywhere in a pitch deck. He looked up property management companies in the Phoenix metro area and called 7 of them on Thursday morning. He said he had logistics and maintenance coordination experience and was available immediately on a part-time or contract basis. 4 did not call back. 2 said they had nothing. 1 said, "Come in Friday at 9. He was there at 8:45. The man who interviewed him was direct and unimpressed by most things. Kieran said, until Kieran stopped talking about his background and started talking about the Saturday water heater problem. Specifically the sequence of decisions you made when you had a tenant without hot water and a plumber who didn't answer, and a property owner who was in a different time zone." The man leaned forward slightly and asked a question. Kieran answered it. The man asked another. They talked for 40 minutes. He started the following Monday at $19 an hour, on call 3 days a week. He did not tell Simone immediately. This was a mistake, though, not the one he thought it was. He didn't tell her because he was still not entirely sure how to hold the information about himself that this week had been accumulating. He had spent 4 years building a version of himself that was always 3 months away from closing a significant deal, and that version did not have a good place to put $19 an hour maintenance coordination. But the version sitting in that interview room on a Friday morning, the one who talked about the water heater without trying to turn it into a narrative about entrepreneurial problem-solving, had felt more like a person he could actually be. He told her on a Sunday evening they were sitting in the apartment with takeout from a Thai place 2 blocks away, the cheapest thing on the menu. Simone had already told him about the community health job. She had described Eugenia and the specific sequence of coffee maker buttons with more warmth than Kieran had heard from her in a while. He set down his fork and said, "I took a job." He told her the details. He did not dress them up. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The water heater thing. I remember you telling me about that. You called it a disaster." "It was," he said, "but I fixed it." She looked at him the way she had looked at her father's face in the study. trying to determine what category of thing she was looking at. What she saw was that the category was new. They ate the rest of dinner without talking very much, but it was the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. 2 weeks into the 30 days, Simone walked 3 blocks from the community health office to a food pantry that Eugenia had mentioned offhandedly as a place the organization sometimes coordinated with. She had an afternoon free and a list of names. Eugenia had asked her to follow up with regarding a donation drive that was already 2 weeks behind schedule. The pantry was run out of a converted garage on a residential block in Mesa. The man who answered the door when she knocked was in his late 50s, wearing a canvas apron with paint on it from what appeared to be a job other than painting. His name was Roland. He had run the pantry out of his garage for 9 years, every Saturday and Sunday, mostly alone. He had a bad hip that he mentioned once and did not mention again. His wife had left 7 years ago. He had a son in Denver who called on birthdays. Simone asked him about the donation drive. He showed her his system for tracking it, which was a spiral notebook with dates and amounts written in 2 different ink colors and a post-it note system on the garage wall she found, when she examined it, to be more sophisticated than it looked. She helped him enter 3 weeks of backlog data into a spreadsheet on a borrowed laptop. Then she did not leave because she had noticed, while they were working, that his hip was slowing him the way things slow a person who has been working around pain for long enough that they no longer register it as an exceptional event. She came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. She reorganized the intake process and drafted a simple volunteer schedule and drafted a letter to 3 local businesses asking for food donations that Roland had been meaning to send for 4 months. She did not announce this as a project. She just did it, the way she had learned in her 2 weeks with Eugenia, that the most reliable way to do useful things was to do them without making them a presentation first. Roland watched her work the way experienced people watch someone who is becoming competent at something, with a particular quality of quiet attention that is different from watching and different from helping and different from judging. On the 3rd Saturday, he said, without looking up from the donation notebook, "You're good at this, not the spreadsheet part, the part where you figure out what actually needs to happen and do it." "I'm learning," Simone said. "I know," he said. "That's what I meant." The last week arrived with the particular quality of things that have taken longer than expected to become clear. Simone had stopped checking the days. Kieran had stopped tracking his deck analytics, a habit he had been unaware of until it was gone, the way you don't notice a sound until the room is quiet. On a Thursday afternoon, 2 days before the 30 days ended, Simone sat on a concrete step outside the pantry garage while Roland made coffee inside. She had her phone in her hand and was not looking at it. A neighborhood cat walked by and did not slow down. A school bus stopped at the corner, opened its door, released 4 children and a backpack and a Tuesday library book, then left. She had $48 remaining of the original $200. She had earned $704 in total from the community health position. She had spent less than she expected on almost everything and more than she expected on 1 or 2 things that turned out to matter more than she thought they would. A decent pair of walking shoes for the distance between bus stops, coffee for Roland on the Saturdays she came, a birthday card for Eugenia she had found in a gas station rack and signed and left on Eugenia's desk without saying anything about it. The 30 days had not changed who she was. She understood this now in a way she hadn't at the beginning. What they had done was remove the distance between who she was and what she was actually doing. She had spent 4 years in a job that had her name on it and her father's company behind it, and had not once required her to sit across from a person who did not know her last name and figure out what she could actually offer. What she had discovered was both smaller and larger than she'd expected. Smaller because it was ordinary, larger because it was real. Kieran was at his 2nd week of maintenance coordination when a dishwasher failed in an apartment complex in Tempe during a stretch of days when 3 other things had also failed, and the property manager who was supposed to be handling the queue was out sick. Kieran managed all 4 in a single day without raising his voice and without missing a callback and without delegating anything to a person who was not in a position to handle it. At 5:30, the property manager called him from home to check in, and Kieran walked him through what had been resolved and what was still pending, and the property manager said, "How long have you been doing this?" Kieran said, "Couple weeks." The property manager was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can we talk about your hours next week?" Kieran said yes. He walked to his car and sat in it for a moment, in the parking lot with the window down and the October evening coming in. The heat gone, the air dry and clear, the way Phoenix air is clear in fall, and felt something he had not felt in a long time, which was the specific satisfaction of a problem being solved not as a stepping stone, and not as a pitch, and not as an entry on a credential, but because there was a problem, and he was the person who could solve it, and he had solved it. He called Simone. He did not tell her about the property manager's question yet. He said, "How's Roland?" She said, "His hip is worse. He won't say so. Can we do something about it?" "I've been thinking about that," she said. The 1st of November was a Sunday. Warren was in the study when they arrived, sitting at the old roll-top desk with 2 cups of coffee he had poured at exactly the time he calculated they would walk through the door, which turned out to be accurate within 4 minutes. He had not rehearsed what he would say. He had not prepared a rubric. He had spent 30 days trying not to call them, which he had managed, and trying not to check his other contacts for informal updates on what they were doing, which he had managed less well. He knew Simone was working somewhere in Mesa. He did not know the details. This was enough to let him sleep. They sat across from him. Simone put an envelope on the desk. It contained $48 and a folded piece of paper. On the paper was a list, 3 columns. The first was expenses, recorded to the dollar. The second was income. The third was a heading she had written at the top that said simply, "What I learned, I could do." Under the third column, there were 8 items. The last one read, "Ask for help without knowing the answer first." Kieran did not have an envelope. He had a text message he showed Warren, a screenshot of the property manager's message from Friday afternoon. The message said, "I want to bring you on at expanded hours. Let's talk rates. When you're ready." "I wasn't ready for 4 years," Kieran said. "I think I'm ready now." Warren looked at the message. He looked at the list on Simone's paper. He looked at his daughter's face, which carried the particular tiredness of a person who has been working at something real, and the particular steadiness that comes from the same source. He picked up his coffee cup. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "There's a community services nonprofit I've been funding quietly for 2 years. They need someone to manage their donor coordination and operations. The woman who is doing it retired in August." He looked at Simone. "It pays real money. Not what you were making before, but real." He looked at Kieran. "The company that manages 3 of my commercial properties has been telling me for 6 months they need a new maintenance operations lead. The job is yours if you want it, not because of my name, because of what I'm going to tell them you can do." He paused. "I sent you out because I needed to know if you could find your own floor. Not mine. Yours." He set his coffee down. Outside the window, November had come to Phoenix quietly. The way November came here, not with cold or with leaves, but with a certain slant of afternoon light that made everything look slightly more deliberate than it had the month before. "I found mine when I was 24, Warren said, standing outside a storefront with a sign I hadn't finished painting. "I needed to know if either of you could find yours without me holding the door." Simone said, "I found someone else's first." "Tell me," he said. She told him about Roland, the garage, the spiral notebook with 2 ink colors, the birthday card in the gas station rack, the hip he wouldn't mention again. Warren listened without filling the sentences. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What does he need?" She said, "Consistent volunteers, a real intake system, someone to help him write the grant applications he keeps putting off because he doesn't think he's a good enough writer." She paused. "He's a good enough writer. He just needs someone to tell him." "Can you do that?" Warren said. "I already started," she said. Warren set both hands flat on his father's desk, the way his father had set his hands flat on things when he had made up his mind. He had not noticed until now that he had inherited the gesture. "Then we have a plan," he said. What happened over the following months was not remarkable in ways that would appear in a quarterly report or a business journal. Simone took the nonprofit coordination role and spent her first week rebuilding a donor database that had been managed through 3 different systems and a folder of paper files going back to 2009. She was not the most experienced person in the organization. She became the most organized, which turned out to matter more than experience in a place where things had been running on goodwill and institutional memory and the heroic workarounds of people who had been there too long to see what was broken. She drove to Roland's garage on Saturdays. She brought a new volunteer each time for the first 2 months. People from the nonprofit network she was building. People who showed up because she had asked them personally and had not made the ask sound like an obligation. The grant application she helped Roland finish was funded in March. He called her on a Tuesday morning to tell her, and his voice had in it the particular quality of a person who has been working towards something for years and has stopped expecting it to arrive and was genuinely surprised. She heard that quality and recognized it. Kieran ran maintenance operations for 2 of Warren's commercial properties by January. He was not performing competence. He was finding out what it felt like to be competent at something that actually needed doing, and the difference was significant enough that he stopped explaining himself at dinner parties and started talking less and listening more, and finding that the conversations he was having were better. He called his own father for the first time in 2 years on a Tuesday evening in December, not because anything in particular had happened, but because he had spent 30 days learning what it felt like to be given an honest chance by a person who did not have to give it, and found he had something to say about that. Warren retired from the active management of Aldrich Distribution in the spring, 18 months ahead of the schedule his board had been anticipating. He moved into an advisory role. He gave Simone a seat at the table she had not asked for, which was different from every seat he had ever offered her before. He kept the photograph of his mother on the desk in the study, the sign slightly crooked, the door not yet painted, her face entirely certain. He had looked at that photograph for 30 years and understood it as a record of a beginning. He understood it differently now. It was a record of a person who had found her floor and stood on it and decided that was enough to build from. That was all it had ever taken. That was, he thought, exactly enough.